Lecture looks at Aborigines and Pacific Islanders, native geography in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Ocean. Basically, we want to take a look at cultural changes in this part of the world caused mostly by migration, but also through diffusion. And then we're going to evaluate the spread of cultural traits to see where they have converged, diverged, where ideas have changed. So to begin, we have to look at the waves of migration that occurred in the Pacific Ocean. So keep in mind, the Pacific Ocean consists really of three different cultural areas. You have your Melanesian cultures that are largely down here to the south. You've got your Polynesian cultures that exist up here in the eastern portion of the Pacific Ocean, and then your Micronesian cultures up here in the north. So three different cultural areas. They do share some similarities, but they do also have some differences as well. So in terms of some of the major cultural groups or some of the largest indigenous populations here, you have the Aboriginal population, or what are oftentimes referred to as the Aborigines, that exist here in Australia. And then you have the Polynesian culture, and more specifically the Maori culture, that spans all the way from the north here in Hawaii down here to the south of New Zealand. And so, in terms of linguistics, same language, they even refer to each other by the same indigenous name. So, the Kanaka Maoli, as they're known in Hawaii, the Kanaka Maori, as they're known in New Zealand. And these cultures originated in Southeast Asia. So when we look at Southeast Asia, that's already an incredibly diverse place in the world. You have ethnic groups and linguistic groups that migrated eastward from South Asia that have a lot more in similarity towards Indian culture. You have cultural groups that migrated south from what is modern day China, and they share a lot of cultural similarities there. But even after they migrated into this region, the migrations didn't stop. So when you take a look at, say, the country of Malaysia today, there are sections of Malaysia on the peninsula that are predominantly Chinese, as Chinese groups continued to migrate and resettle in that part of the world. So already a very diverse part of the world. What happens? Well, starting around 4000 BC, those cultures began to migrate out and across the Pacific Ocean. So some of them, as they migrated outward, they stopped, they turned southward here towards Australia. By about 1500, we see people that are migrating into the area that is modern day Fiji. And then they continued on into Tahiti, where they split off into different directions. So one group eventually splintering off to found a civilization in New Zealand, others continuing over almost to the coast of South America to Eastern Island, and yet another group by between 300 and 1200 AD migrating north to Hawaii. And these were people that when they migrated, they used technology that, if we look at it today in terms of maritime technology, we might think that it's very simplistic, but it was very well designed for their purposes. So they had two different types of canoes that they relied on, and they still rely on in many of these islands. One is what was called the outrigger canoe, and this is a canoe that has a main hull here, and then from the main hull you have a couple poles that split off, and they support a beam that rides out there and gives it stability. And then here they can put a mast with a sail, and that's basically what they use to migrate from island to island. So this is like if you're living here in, say, French Polynesia, and you want to go from Tahiti to like some of the immediate surrounding islands, or to, just simply sail in your local vicinity, that's what you would use. For migration across the open ocean, though, they relied on a different style. Here, what they did is they used voyaging canoes. And so, what they would have on a voyaging canoe are two really large hulls. And these hulls were then connected in between by a platform right here. And then on this platform, what the Pacific Islanders would do is they would come in and they could actually build like a small little cabin for you to store whatever you needed to take with you. Usually taro plants, which is kind of like it's almost like it's a root, tubular type of a plant that you actually grind down. And that's what you use to make poi, which is this pasty, kind of purplish looking substance that you can eat, and it gives you a lot of starch and protein. But you could carry poi, you could carry coconuts, you could carry other types of grains and other types of fruits with you, and then as they would migrate to all these other islands, they would plant these crops, and that's how these plants would eventually spread across the Pacific Ocean. So you had that little room for basically your storage and everything else that you would need, and then rising up from here, you would have, of course, a mast. You would have your rudder, here on the back, and then this is what you would basically use to travel across the ocean. Now, today, if we want to travel across the ocean, we have all sorts of technology that we can use. There's GPS, global positioning systems. There's, of course, the maps that we have meticulously developed over centuries of seafaring. They didn't rely on these, though. Instead, they relied on what were called stick charts. So, if you ever went and you looked at a stick chart today, and we still have some of them, we might look at it and think, oh, it's literally just a bunch of sticks tied together with, some shells, kind of added in here and there at random points. To us, it wouldn't really make much sense. I mean, how does anybody take a bunch of sticks and use it as a map? Well, this told the navigator for the voyaging canoe everything that they needed to know. Basically, what we know today, what we've learned over the years of talking with people that still have this knowledge, that's passed it down from generation to generation, as well as the historical record, is that this told the Pacific Islanders the directions of different ocean currents. And then usually what these shells were is these were islands that they were looking for. And the way that you would read it is that these sticks themselves and the shape of them would basically tell you, okay, there is an ocean current flowing in a certain direction that breaks against the island and changes direction, if you sail at it from a certain, vector. And then that's what you were basically doing. So this was on par with, those of us that live, like, say, in the Great Plains, of using a topographical map, a map that shows the different elevation of the land to navigate on the Great Plains, which is, something that you can do. So one thing that they did is they used the ocean itself, different currents, knowing which way currents flowed, how to track them. And then, of course, up in the night sky, they had the stars as well as the sun, and together all of these different things was what basically told them how to get from somewhere as what we would view as remote as Hawaii, from a great distance, from all the way down here in Tahiti, which you're talking about thousands of miles. Now, in terms of the different cultures that live there, there are some similarities, but then there are also some differences that have, developed over time. So, we believe that, waves of people came and settled different areas. And today, if you go to many of these islands, physically there are differences, linguistically there are differences, religiously, the way that they organize around social structures also. So one thing that travelers to this part of the world oftentimes immediately latched onto are like some of the physical differences between people that live in Oceania. So if you take a look at Aborigines, for example, Aborigines tended to have a darker color of skin. In terms of tattoo art, they did practice tattoo art. Um, but if you ever took a look at the tattoos and then the face painting, it's very different in terms of the geometrical designs that they would use. I mean, even the way that they developed clothes was different. Polynesians, on the other hand, they tended to have that unique Polynesian tattoo art that has kind of become popular among people that go out and get tattoo designs. Um, with the Polynesian tattoo, for example, usually the guys would get it on their shoulder. And today, it might, if you look at someone with a Polynesian tattoo, it might just seem like a bunch of, shapes and designs that just kind of look cool. But this actually tells, if you get your tattoo done traditionally, a lot of times it would tell like your family history. So you would read the tattoo and what it means for that individual person. Now, one thing about all these cultures, though, is they were all pretty much hunter gatherers. So the Aborigine people living in Australia definitely, remained hunter gatherers largely due to the aridity of the continent. Uh, they all relied, especially on the islands, in a very large degree on uh, marine animals, marine life for food, what we would call aquaculture, and even those that had larger lands that they could rely on. So one thing that's been discovered within Australia, for example, is that the Aborigines actually developed a series of canals that they would use for, one for irrigation, but also for a unique form of aquaculture to create these man-made ponds that they could use as a source of fish. And this is something that you definitely found also in, like, say, the Hawaiian Islands. So if this is, say, like your beach in Hawaii, what Native Hawaiians or Kanaka Maoli would do is they would go in and they would dig out, a little ways back from the beach, a man-made pond. And then when the tide came in, it would flood just enough to provide, a way for fish and crabs and, other marine life to find their way into this pond. But then when the tide went out, this is all that was left, basically cutting them off. And so then the person could come in and, fish really easily and take what they needed for protein. Uh, for the Aborigines, the Micronesians, Melanesians, clan life is pretty much what shaped them. So usually when we take a look at these cultures, this is where the cultures differ, throughout the region. Uh, Again, tends to be more clan based, more family type based in terms of how they organize their society. And this was very different than say the Polynesians that were very hierarchical. So when we take a look at Polynesian society, usually what you had at the very top was a group of people known as Ali'i. And Ali'i were basically the equivalent of, say, like kings and nobles in Europe. And so you would usually have an Ali'i Nui, the main noble, what we would call a king at the very top. And then below him, he would have lesser Ali'i. And then eventually you would work your way down the pyramid to the very bottom of the society, and this is where you would find what we call, or what they called, the Maka'inana, the people. And so the society relied on this hierarchical structure. The Ali'i at the top, they provided direction and stability and safety for the people, and then the Maka'inana in exchange, they were the ones that built the housing, made the clothes, fished, hunted, and did all the other things. And then you had a priestly caste within Polynesian society known as the Kahuna, and you could have different priests for different purposes. So usually you would have what was known as a Kahuna Nui, the the big kahuna, the great kahuna that was in charge of all the religious rituals. But then you can have like smaller priests, smaller religious people that would say bless their voyaging canoes to do their fishing. And one of the important things among the Polynesians was the concept known as mana. And so this was a spiritual power that Ali'i had in abundance, and that's what gave them the right and the ability to rule. Now, throughout the Pacific Ocean, most of these people followed what's known as animism. So again, the belief that uh, spirits inhabit nature around you. That on the one hand, yeah, you may have a god or gods, but then nature itself has these different spirits that direct them and then inhabit them. Uh, and some of these religions, they did differ. They were unique to different cultural areas. So among the Aborigines, for example, they have a belief that in what's known as the dreaming, that the world itself was dreamt into existence, and that there's the physical part of human beings and what you experience on your day-to-day life, but then there's the dream, the spiritual existence. And to them, within the dreaming, there's no real past or present or future. Everything kind of happens simultaneously. So to them, dreams are very important. They're very powerful. And this is different than, say, again, if we go back to the Polynesian society, within Polynesian society, did they have elements of animism? Yes, they did. So you would have akua. Akua were basically these like spirit animals that could help you out. So like the shark, for example, could be an example of like an akua, as could a gecko or an owl, or many of the other birds. But they did have a very, just like within their society, a structured religious system in which you did have gods, and each of the gods had, their own hierarchy. So you had a mother god and a father god, the two main creator gods, and from them were all these other children that came from them that had their own powers over nature. So a good example of this would be Pele. She's not one of the main creator gods, but she is still a very important goddess, because she was goddess of the volcanoes. And as we know, on the Hawaiian Islands and Fiji, Tahiti, these other main Polynesian islands, these are high islands that were created by volcanic eruptions. And so, the volcanoes, on the one hand, it could be a very destructive power, but it was also a very creative power as well, creating land. And then finally, in terms of, material culture, again, there were some similarities, but there were also some differences. So in the case of some of the similarities, taro, again, that starchy plant that, you would dig up the root and crush it down to form poi. You find taro on tropical islands ranging from Micronesia to Melanesia all the way out to Polynesia. But then, the different ecosystems gave rise to different cultures. So the Aborigine people, for example, they did, they did rely on marine life for food. They also had an abundance of land-dwelling animals that they could hunt and live off of. Whereas, say, the predators that Polynesians had to deal with came in the form of, say, a great white shark. On the other hand, Aborigines had to learn how to survive in environments that had crocodiles and alligators, some of the most poisonous snakes on the planet, not to forget about, say, the funnel spider, one of the most deadly spiders in Australia. And their culture, reflected to this, as an adaptation to their environment. So, their housing tended to, especially in the more arid regions of the outback, be very basic, lean-tos that could be used when they were in that area, and then, left as the clan traveled to another. Uh, they could hunt animals, fur-bearing animals, skin them, and use that to make clothes. Out here in Polynesia, on the other hand, usually their houses were more permanent, made of wood and palm fronds, thatched roofs to keep the rain off you in this more in this wetter environment. But they didn't necessarily have fur-bearing animals, especially large ones, that they could hunt and then skin for clothes. So instead, what many Polynesians did is they would use bird feathers, especially for the clothing of the elite, the nobles. They would make these big feather robes and hats that they would wear. But most people usually the cloth that they wore, as you see in these pictures down here, that was actually made from the bark of trees. So they would find they had bark that was very light, very flexible, that they could use and they could transform into clothing. So some similarities, but also some differences as well. But these were the major indigenous cultures prior to the arrival of Europeans to the area. And by the time Europeans started arriving in this part of the world, they had already had extensive contact with Native Americans in the Americas. And so by that time, ship's captains had a good understanding of what disease could do to these populations that had never been exposed to them. So some of the ship's captains that were more famous, like Captain Cook, for example, did try to take steps to prevent disease from breaking out through their contact among these people. But in the end, what would eventually happen through contact, through the establishment of European colonies, through the loss of indigenous lands, is that their populations dwindled over time. They have, however, lately seen a resurgence, both in terms of population numbers, but also in terms of indigenous rights. So in the case of the Aborigine, for example, they recently received one of their most sacred sites back, what was once known as Ayers Rock, the Red Mountain of Uluru. So they've been making gains in this area. But unique cultures, they do share a lot of similarities, but they do have a lot of differences as well in cultures that we have to take into consideration when we look at the geography of Oceania.